All right. So, categorical imperative questions. Kant makes sense. We like Kant so far? No, we don't like Kant because of the axe wielding example. No, yeah. This is so. He later goes on to expound a different idea that, when combined with the categorical imperative, might actually make us feel a little bit better about the axe wielding maniac. So it's worth talking about. Kant believes the rational beings are ends in themselves. Those are the words he uses. And that doesn't always make a whole ton of sense all by itself. So I'm going to back up a little bit. Has everyone in here heard the phrase like, it's a means to an end? What does that mean? Something is a means to an end. Okay, so a means, the means is the instrument, the tool by which you accomplish some end, right? Some goal of yours, right? A means, like, for example, you might be, a good example actually is, you might be going to college to get a degree, and that degree is a means to the end of getting a particular job that you want. Right? So a means is a tool, and it is usually said to have instrumental value. Right? A means has instrumental value. It is valuable insofar as it is a good tool. Right? If you want to drive a nail into a wall, a hammer has a lot of instrumental value, but a block of butter doesn't really. Right? You're not going to get very far trying to hammer in a nail with a stick of butter. I don't know where that example just came from. Pulled it out of my head. It's not a bad one, I think. Means have instrumental value, whereas ends usually have, I cannot write tonight, usually have intrinsic value. They are valuable in and of themselves. That's what makes them ends, right? They are the goal for you, potentially, right? Actually, we could maybe reframe that, right? I said the college degree is intended to get a particular job that you want, but maybe you want that job for the paycheck. So maybe the paycheck is the actual end, and both the job and the degree are instrumental means to accomplish that end. And you could go further than that, possibly. Actually, what you want is not the paycheck, but the Ferrari that the paycheck will allow you to buy. And so the Ferrari is the actual end. I might not like Ferraris, but you know what I mean, right? The Ferrari might be the ends, and therefore everything else is actually a means to that. And then, of course, you can go further, and people have not, I'm not going to worry about it in this case, but really maybe it's not the Ferrari that you want, it's the happiness that comes from driving the Ferrari. And so, in fact, happiness is the ends, and everything else is a means to that. And then you get into like hedonism and Epicurus and so on. That was his whole argument, that that's what we're actually all aiming at, that happiness. But that's not the point here. My point is that we have ends and we have means, and means are the things we use to accomplish an end. Now, says Kant, another good quotation here, I say that man, and by man, that's non-gender specific sense of the term man, right? He means men and women. Man in general, and in general, every rational being. That's an interesting sense, sort of interesting phrase for the 18th century. Because what other kind of rational beings are there than people? Animals are not rational, right? They are not capable of reason. So what else could he be imagining? Spirits? Ghosts? God? Divinities? Aliens? I don't know. It's a weird thing to say, right? I don't know what else he's imagining besides. Remember, he's a rationalist, so he's not getting into religion and stuff, right? So it's an interesting sort of little phrase he throws in there, but I don't know that it's super important. It just strikes me as weird. Anyway, now I say that man exists as an end in himself and not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will. What does that mean? Yeah, absolutely anti-slavery, but it's anti lots of things. Why? Yeah, absolutely. Slavery would be an example of what this is not encouraging. What does it mean when we say that man exists as an end in himself and not merely as a means. Ms. Tony. To Well, he's not saying that we should all be happy. Like, come on, guys, let's all Care Bear it up and right, sparkly rainbows and right. That's not what he's suggesting. He's not. I mean, some people should be miserable, right? Some people are and should be based on their circumstances. That's not what he's suggesting. He's saying that man exists as an end. Don't confuse my example of happiness as a potential end. I was just an example of an end, right? He's not talking about happiness here. He's saying that man is an end. Good, yeah, right? Anything. Patrick, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that. So if we looked at a instrument in like we could not be the instrument, we have to be. We would have to be like the whole.
Yeah.
Before man.
Yeah, good. Yeah, both of those, right? That's a more specific example, and that's a more general statement, but they both basically get into the same point. People cannot be instruments for other people's ends. All right? People cannot be instruments for other people's ends. People, just by virtue of being people, by being rational beings, have intrinsic value. Every person has intrinsic value, not merely instrumental value. And that merely is really important. So, to go on, whoever is acting, right? He must, in all his actions, whether directed to himself or to other rational beings, always be regarded at the same time as an end. That's every person must be regarded as an end, not as a means to an end. So, what does that end up kind of signifying? I don't want to say mean again. Yeah. Everyone has equal value. Every person is equal value. And that then means that, and that value is, again, intrinsic. And so, and that, again, means that that no one can use anyone else merely as a tool or as an end, or I'm sorry, as a means to some other end, as I said. So, for example, the factory worker in the factory, right, he is working for the boss of the factory. And so it might seem like that person is being used as a means to accomplish the end of building whatever it is they make in the factory. However, how do we avoid treating that factory worker as a means, merely a means? We pay him, right? He benefits fairly from that work. And so now he is no longer merely a means, he is his own end, right? He is working towards his own ends of benefiting himself and getting paid and so on. Right? Obviously, slavery is an example of using a human being as a means rather than as an end. But there are other examples. Anytime you use someone as just a tool, I want to meet this person because I think his brother is really cute. And so I'm going to get close to him so I can meet his brother, right? That's an example of using that person as a means to another end, right? And we have to avoid that. What Kant's saying is we have to avoid that idea of using a person as a tool. Right? Does that make sense? That makes sense, right? And this is complicated, right? Because we have to be careful about stuff like when we pay the factory worker, it's not enough just to give him money. We have to give him an appropriate amount of money. That's right, right? We have to pay him reasonably, right? And this is where Walmart gets into trouble, right? Walmart does not pay its employees reasonably. And so in that way, Walmart often treats its employees as means, not as ends, right? Do you know that 1% of all the people in the world work at Walmart? Yes. 1 out of every 100 people in the world work at Walmart. It's shocking. Shocking. It's a lot of people. Anyway, unrelated. Unrelated to anything. It's just one of those things like, what? Anyway. Yeah, absolutely. If you're using your father as a means to get a job, for example, then that would be using that person as a means and rather than an end. What else? I mean, there are all sorts of examples. Yep. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, there are lots of ways. The problem with this description, right? I think this is a really interesting idea, and it's sort of a brand new thing. Remember that I've kind of I've presented this in sort of a weird order. If you remember the dates, I don't know if I even gave the dates for Bentham. Bentham's after Kant, right? So Kant is not responding to utilitarianism, even though I presented utilitarianism first, and I did that because I think it's a little bit easier to understand. So Kant is doing this sort of from nothing, right? He's coming up with all of these ideas by himself out of nowhere, and this is a pretty amazing thing to come up with just all on his own. It's pretty cool and really nicely put. That said, it's not very specific. We can come up with all sorts of ways. Well, how about in this circumstance? And it's really hard to know for sure whether you're treating someone as a means or as an end. But what he's really wants to focus on, and I think helps us, is if we make sure that we include this word anytime we're thinking about this, right? The fact that the word merely is in there, right? It's okay to sometimes treat people as means because we do it all the time. When we order the burger from the guy working at McDonald's, we are using that person as a tool to get the burger that we want, right? But then we pay that guy. And so we're not using him merely as a means to an end. Right? And it also requires a little bit of concept, I don't know, sort of imagination. Right? When you lie to your neighbor about returning the money that you're going to borrow from him, you are now using that neighbor as a means to you having the money, right? Merely as a means to you having the money, right? And it doesn't matter how you treated him yesterday, according to Kant, right? You could be buddies, you'd be really good neighbors, but as soon as you switch over to I'm going to borrow this money and I'm not going to give it back to you, you have started treating that person as a means, not an end. So it's not like I only ever treated this guy as a means. It's if it happens once, now you've fallen into a bad action. Yes. So and sometimes it's harder than that. That's a pretty easy one to keep track of. Slavery is obviously really easy to see how that's means and an end, but it can be harder when we talk about things like theft. Right? Is stealing from somebody treating that person as a means? Yeah, that's Kant's going to say that is obviously murder. Whatever it is you're trying to accomplish by killing someone, right? You're treating that person as the sort of the obstacle in the way, like, and then I get to do whatever I want to do. Sometimes it's easier to see than others, but Kant's going to argue that anytime you treat someone poorly, you're treating them as a means to an end. And so this is what allows us, according to Kant, we all sort of understand this without it really having to be explained to us. And so by using our reason, we get to the point where, remember the butcher who was cheating his customers, and we all kind of felt like that seems wrong. And Kant says this is why, because we realize that what that butcher's doing is treating all of those customers as means to his making more money, right? Rather than giving them a fair trade for their money, right? The appropriate amount of meat. You're using them just as tools to get what you want, which is money. And he says that we all kind of get this without having to really think about it super clearly. That it just happens. We understand this because, and this is the other sort of remarkable thing about Kant, given the time in which he lived, which I've erased. Again, what does this say about people, individual people, and their relationship to each other? We said this already, but I want to just say it again because it's important, I think. What is Kant saying about the value of people. Everybody is equally valuable. Everyone has equal value. And that's where we start to see, right? When you start, and that's also built into this whole idea of the universalization of rules, right? We're talking about, would I want everybody to do this maxim that I'm considering? Then we're talking about the fact that everybody is equally valuable, right? Because we're starting to stop thinking about just me and start thinking about, what if other people acted this way? And that's a sort of perception that a lot of people didn't have until this period of time, when we start to think about everyone having worth and dignity, right? Remember when you read Peter Singer, when he was talking about the Ashley's treatment bit? That was one of the things you did this last week, about the surgery that she wanted to have. And a lot of people argue against the surgery because of the sort of dignity of that human, and that we shouldn't be performing surgeries on people because they have inherent value, right? We are not going to treat her as a means to our more living in a more convenient way end, right? I think Peter Singer makes some pretty strong arguments there. I think that's a really complicated circumstance. I don't know there's a good answer for that, honestly. At least I don't know that utilitarianism or Kantian ethics answer that perfectly, but there is a good answer. I'm just not sure that we can get there through one of these things. But it's really interesting, right? We've now Kant has ascribed equal value to all people. And that's good, I think. Seems like a good thing. And by the way, who else does he mention in this sentence that has equal value? What's that? Say it again. And he does not talk about animals. No, he doesn't say anything about dogs. No, remember, those are the things we're kicking. Himself. Right? Dogs are not rational, and so they don't get. And no animals are rational. In fact, Kant's totally okay with treating animals as means. Right? Raise an animal, kill it so you can eat it. That seems fair to me. Right? That's what they're there for. That's okay. He does not have a problem with that. But it's interesting that he does say, in all his actions, whether directed to himself or to other rational beings, must always be regarded at the same time as an end. So each person also has to value him or herself as an end and not as a means. What does that mean? You should not. Even if you agree to it, you should not let people use you as a means. So, for example, Kant was very much opposed to prostitution. Right? He felt that was letting other people use you as a means rather than an end. Obviously, Kant would be opposed to suicide. Right? The idea of having value intrinsically that you recognize and also treat yourself with is just as important as treating other people and for them to treat you that way. Right? So it's an interesting, right? It's certainly ahead of its time. Right? For 18th century philosophy, this is pretty impressive. Are there questions about ends in themselves? So what we see is, if we combine these two ideas, the categorical imperative and the idea of ends in themselves, we get what's called often the second formulation of the categorical imperative. This is just a combining the two things we've already talked about. So this is your imperative, you should act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. And so if you do that, right, Kant believes that you are going to be good, that you will act right. You will act with goodwill, with good intent. Consequences might not always work out. That's not your fault. You're not responsible for the consequences as long as you act with goodwill, according to Kant. And this is right. You might say, wait, where did the whole universalizing the maxim thing go? And this is the maxim that Kant wants to universalize. If you universalize just this maxim, you don't need to do any others. You don't have to sit around and think, oh, should I rob the bank? Well, no, obviously you shouldn't rob the bank, because you're treating all of the people who put the money in that bank as a means rather than an end. And so that gets to not be a thing you get to do. Questions? Questions. And so finally, and this is the end of my little presentation, finally you get this thing that Kant calls the kingdom of ends. Right? In his world, Kant imagines that if all people followed the categorical imperative, in which they disregard their personal inclinations, right? Remember, we're talking about duty versus inclination. This is like the opposite of egoism. You disregard what you want to do and instead only act according to the categorical imperative, where you constantly treat other people as ends, not means, then everybody will end up following the same good rules because everybody will have universalized their intention. Everybody will be acting in a way such that they would want everyone else to act. And this world, in which everyone is doing the right thing and nobody is abusing anyone else, and that's a very loose use of the word abuse, all right, would be called the kingdom of ends. This is Kant's idea of paradise. The kingdom of ends in which everyone acts in a way that they're treating everyone else with dignity, with intrinsic value. What do you think? Marissa's on board. Yes? Other thoughts? It's good. It is interesting, and it's been extremely powerful over the years. People have spent a lot of time and money and effort over the last 300 years, 250 years, picking this apart very carefully, trying to figure out how to, whether it makes sense, how to improve it, because it can use some improving. Trying to make it into a thing that applies. But it has, in its most basic form, some really powerful ideas. I don't know, Crystal, if you still feel this way, but last week you talked about like intent matters. And I think that a lot of people believe that, even if they've never really thought about it in that way. And for Kant to talk about the idea that it matters whether or not what you are trying to do matters sometimes more than what you actually do. That's the sort of thing that resonates with us. And I think also this idea of treating every human being as equally valuable is important. Now, we don't act this way, as we can see in modern day, right? America first, everybody else second, right? Then we're not. Clearly, there are people in this country who do not act this way, but it seems to make sense in a lot of ways. Maybe. Don't forget that we have had some criticisms, right? That we did talk about those criticisms that were above, and some of them, well, that was good scrolling. Some of them are a little bit easier to get around than others, but we can see how, coming back to this, right? The loophole thing stops being as big a deal when you start just saying, look, Joe, it doesn't matter that you like denim or Metallica or whatever. You just have to treat the people who run the bank as people, and then stealing is not an issue anymore, right? It's not even a potentiality, no matter how narrowly you try to define your personal maxim. What is the rationality, right? If we go by this kingdom of ends ideal, then maybe we do all get to the same basic goals that we're trying to accomplish, and it's not that hard. And this even handles the axe wielding guy, in theory, right? Maybe it's okay to lie to the axe wielder, because in some ways, claiming that I don't have responsibility for the consequences as long as I acted with goodwill is that's just treating my friend as a means to my end of wanting to feel like I did the right thing. And so I can't do that. I have to treat my best friend as an end. It matters whether or not that person lives. And so it's okay for me in that case to lie to the axe-wielding maniac, even though he said there were no exceptions. What he really meant is there are no exceptions to treating people with dignity. Yeah, and so it does seem to pull around some of these things back around and make things feel better to us. Nevertheless, it's not a perfect system. For example, as Braysha brought up, dogs aren't in this. Just, dogs, horses, whatever. But maybe they should be, right? Shouldn't we treat animals with dignity, at least some? Well, that was utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism was definitely all about like anything that can feel pain is part of the math. But Kant straight up is like, nope, if you're not rational, you're zero. You have zero math quality here. That doesn't seem quite right. There are other issues, right? And this kind of goes back to the Ashley's treatment thing, right? Does every human being have equal value, right? When in fact some human beings aren't capable of rational thought. Infants, for example, aren't they somehow really means, at least until they're capable of thinking for themselves? Aren't they in some way possessions, right? A little bit of their parents until, right? You're actually kind of responsible for the way your children behave until they reach a certain age, and you are responsible for feeding them and things like that, right? And so to a certain extent, they are a possession. You can demand them back if someone takes them from you, right? That sort of thing. So maybe children fit into a weird middle space. Severely handicapped people who aren't capable of cognition in the way that we think of when we think of grown-ups, right? That like the Ashley situation, right? It's complicated. It's maybe not as cut and dry as Kant wants it to be, but that's what we've spent a lot of time thinking about. Questions? Yes? No? 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 All right. So moving forward here, looking at things you have to do this week. Not a ton. I want you to read an actual excerpt of Kant. Reading Kant is not easy. I've got a relatively small little piece here, and I think I've talked about it pretty well. So hopefully there will be nothing in here that's new to you, but I do want you to read it anyway. But Kant was writing 18th century German, so it's been translated and it is still kind of a challenge to read. So don't get too frustrated. I want you to do your best to try and get through it here, as he talks about the categorical imperative and the goodwill. And then I just want you to write, again, this is a short answer, 100 words, just basically looking at the categorical imperative, explaining what it's saying and its purpose as far as you understand it. Okay? What the categorical imperative is, what it's trying to accomplish. Yes? And by the way, now is a good time to ask any questions if you're still a little fuzzy on what the categorical imperative is. And then this is an encyclopedia article about Kantian ethics, including his idea of the kingdom of ends. You just need to read sections 1 to 4. Right? Don't read the whole article. It's long and it gets into stuff that we don't need to really worry about right now. So just read sections 1 to 4. And then I would like for you to write your long paper is basically come up with a rule, right? And it's no fair just rewriting the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Your own rule that you think Kant would be willing to universalize into a moral law, and why, right? So, for example, right, I think Kant would be okay with my puppy kicking rule, and here's why. I don't suspect any of you are going to go with that one. That's why I used it. But right, so what do you think Kant would be okay with as a universal law, and why? Yes? Questions? Go home. I will see you next week. Oh, we have a question? Now we have a question? Oh, different. Okay.